welcome to our channel. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Before we dive into today's topic, I want to ask you for a small favor. If you find value in what we share, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. It really helps us continue bringing you content that matters. Today we're going to talk about something that many of us experience but rarely discuss openly. After decades of marriage, some couples wake up one day and realize they've become strangers living under the same roof. It's not always a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it's the quiet moments, the small decisions, the words left unsaid that create an unbridgeable distance between two people who once couldn't imagine life apart. I'm going to share with you 10 critical moments when couples realize they've become strangers to each other. These aren't just observations. These are real experiences from real people who've walked this path. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding these moments, we can prevent them from happening in our own lives. You know, there's something nobody tells you when you're young and in love, standing at that altar, making those vows. Nobody tells you that staying married is actually harder than getting married. Nobody warns you that the person sleeping next to you for 30 years might one day feel like a complete stranger. I've talked to hundreds of people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And you know what I've learned? The end of emotional intimacy in a marriage rarely happens overnight. It's not usually the affair, the big fight, or the financial crisis that does it. It's the accumulation of small moments, small choices, small silences that build up like plaque in an artery until one day, the heart of the marriage just stops beating. So let's talk about these moments. Let's shine a light on them. Because awareness is the first step to prevention. First moment, when you stop fighting. Now, this might surprise you. You might think that fighting is bad for a marriage. And sure, constant conflict is exhausting. But let me tell you something that took me years to understand. When couples stop fighting altogether, it's often not because they've achieved peace. It's because they've given up. Think about it. Fighting means you still care enough to want change. It means you're still invested in the outcome. But when you reach that point where your spouse does something that would have infuriated you 10 years ago, and now you just feel nothing, that's when you know something fundamental has shifted. I remember talking to Margaret, a 62-year-old woman from Ohio. She told me that for years, she and her husband fought about everything. He left dishes in the sink, she spent too much on groceries, he worked too late, she didn't appreciate his effort. They argued constantly. But then one day, she realized they hadn't argued in months. At first, she thought they'd finally found harmony. But the truth was darker. She'd simply stopped caring whether he came home late or not. She'd stopped expecting him to help around the house. She'd checked out emotionally. When you stop fighting, you stop engaging. And when you stop engaging, you become roommates, not partners. You're coexisting, not living together. That's the first sign that the emotional connection is severing. Second moment, when you plan your future alone. Here's a question for you. When you think about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is your spouse in that picture? I mean, really in it, not just physically present, but actively part of your dreams and plans? This is one of the most telling signs that a marriage is dying. When you start planning your future as if you're single, when you think about retirement and realize you're excited about doing things alone, when you imagine your next chapter and your spouse isn't a central character in that story. I know a man named Robert, 70 years old, married for 45 years. He told me that he realized his marriage was over when he was planning a trip to Alaska, something he'd wanted to do his whole life. He spent weeks researching, booking tours, planning activities. And then his wife asked, "When are we going?" And he felt this sinking feeling in his stomach because he'd planned the entire trip for one person. He hadn't even thought to include her. That's when it hits you. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being a we and became two separate I's living parallel lives. You're not building a shared future anymore. You're building separate futures that happen to occupy the same house. Third moment, when physical touch disappears. Let's talk about something that makes people uncomfortable but is absolutely crucial. Physical intimacy. And I'm not just talking about sex, although that's part of it. I'm talking about the small touches. The hand on the shoulder as you pass in the kitchen. The hug when someone comes home. The kiss goodbye that's more than just a peck. The holding hands while watching TV. When was the last time you touched your spouse just because you wanted to feel close to them? When was the last time they touched you? There's something deeply intimate about non-sexual physical touch. It's how we communicate care, affection, and connection without words. And when that disappears, it creates an invisible wall between two people. Susan, a 58-year-old woman I spoke with, said she didn't realize how touch-starved her marriage had become until her grandson hugged her one day, and she started crying. That simple embrace from a child contained more warmth and affection than she'd felt from her husband in years. They'd stopped touching each other sometime in their 40s, she thought. It happened so gradually she didn't even notice. They'd just become two people who shared a bed but lived in separate physical worlds. And here's the thing about physical touch. Its absence creates a feedback loop. The less you touch, the more awkward touching becomes. Until eventually, reaching out to hold your spouse's hand feels like an impossible act of vulnerability. The distance becomes self-perpetuating. Fourth moment, when you stop sharing your inner world. Remember when you first fell in love? Remember how you'd talk for hours about everything and nothing? Your fears, your dreams, that weird thing that happened at work, the random thought you had in the shower? You shared your inner world freely because you trusted this person with the most vulnerable parts of yourself. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you told your spouse something you haven't told anyone else? When was the last time they confided in you about something real, something that mattered? For many couples, somewhere along the way, they stop being each other's confidant. They stop sharing the thoughts that keep them up at night, the dreams that excite them, the fears that paralyze them. Not because they're actively hiding these things, but because they no longer see their spouse as someone who would understand or care. This is what happened to Michael and Patricia. Married 38 years. Michael told me that he realized their marriage was over when his company offered him early retirement, and instead of discussing it with Patricia first, he called his college buddy. He spent 2 hours on the phone talking through his fears, his hopes, his uncertainty about the future. When he got off the phone, Patricia asked who he'd been talking to. He told her. She asked, "What about?" He said, "Work stuff." She said, "Okay," and went back to her book. Neither of them found it strange that he'd made a life-changing decision without her input. That's how disconnected they'd become. When you stop sharing your inner world, you become mysteries to each other. You're living with someone whose thoughts, feelings, and dreams are unknown to you. You're married to a stranger. Fifth moment, when silence becomes the default. Now, there are different kinds of silence in a marriage. There's the comfortable silence of two people who are so attuned to each other that words aren't necessary. And then there's the heavy silence of two people who have nothing left to say to each other. You can feel the difference. Comfortable silence is peaceful. Heavy silence is suffocating. It fills the room like fog, making everything feel distant and unclear. For many couples, especially after retirement, when you're suddenly spending all day together, the silence becomes deafening. You sit across from each other at breakfast with nothing to say. You drive somewhere in the car without speaking. You spend entire evenings in the same room without exchanging more than a handful of words about mundane logistics. Dorothy, 73 years old, told me something that broke my heart. She said that she and her husband had been so silent for so long that when he suddenly had a stroke and couldn't speak, it took her 3 days to realize something was seriously wrong. She'd become so accustomed to his silence that his actual inability to speak wasn't immediately apparent to her. Think about that. The silence in their marriage had become so profound that actual medical muteness blended right in. When silence becomes your default mode of existence together, you've lost one of the most fundamental aspects of human connection: communication. And without communication, you're just two people existing in proximity, not partnership. Sixth moment, when you celebrate victories apart. Here's something that reveals the true state of a marriage. What happens when something good happens to you? Who's the first person you want to tell? Who's the first person you want to celebrate with? In a healthy marriage, your spouse is your first call. They're the person you rush home to tell. They're the one you want to share your joy with because their happiness for you amplifies your own happiness. But when a marriage is dying, that changes. You get a promotion, and you think about calling your sister first. You accomplish something you're proud of, and you share it with your friends before mentioning it to your spouse. You achieve a goal, and when you finally tell your partner, their reaction is so lukewarm that you wish you hadn't bothered. Thomas, 65 years old, told me about the day he found out he'd beaten cancer. He'd been fighting it for 8 months. When the doctor gave him the all clear, he sat in his car in the hospital parking lot and called his son first, then his brother, then his best friend from high school. His wife was his fourth call. And when he called her, he realized he'd called the others first because he knew they'd give him the emotional response he needed. His wife had become so distant during his illness that he couldn't count on her for emotional support even in his greatest moment of relief. When you stop celebrating together, you stop building positive shared memories. Your joys become separate, your triumphs are individual, and the emotional bond that comes from shared happiness dissolves. Seventh moment, when you prefer their absence to their presence. This is perhaps the most painful realization of all. When you notice that you're happier when your spouse isn't around. When you look forward to them going out. When them being home feels like an intrusion rather than a comfort. It might start small. You find yourself volunteering for errands just to get out of the house. You stay at work later than necessary. You find excuses to be in different rooms. You develop separate schedules that minimize the time you spend together. And then one day, it hits you. You're more relaxed when they're not there. The air feels lighter. You can breathe easier. Their presence has become a source of stress rather than comfort. Linda, 61 years old, told me she knew her marriage was over when her husband went on a 2-week fishing trip, and she realized those were the best 2 weeks she'd had in years. She wasn't lonely. She wasn't worried. She was peaceful. And when he came back, she felt her chest tighten as she heard his car in the driveway. The person who was supposed to be your safe harbor had become the storm you were trying to escape. This is a devastating realization because it means the fundamental purpose of marriage, to have a partner who makes life better, has been inverted. Your spouse has become someone who makes life harder just by being present. 8th moment, when you build separate lives. There's a difference between having individual interests and building entirely separate lives. In a healthy marriage, you might have different hobbies, different friends, different ways of spending your time. But you still come back together. You share your experiences. You're interested in each other's worlds, even if you don't fully participate in them. But when a marriage is dying, you build parallel lives that rarely intersect. You have your friends, they have theirs. You have your activities, they have theirs. You have your routines, they have theirs. You're living as two single people who happen to share an address. I talked to a couple, both 67, who realized they'd built completely separate lives when their daughter asked them to describe a typical week. They each described their week to her, and she pointed out that in 7 days they'd spent meaningful time together for maybe 3 hours total. Everything else was separate. Separate gyms, separate social groups, separate volunteering activities, separate TV shows, separate meal times even. They were married on paper, but single in practice. Their lives occasionally crossed paths, but they didn't actually share a life anymore. When you've built separate lives, coming back together requires dismantling structures you've spent years building. It requires vulnerability, effort, and a willingness to integrate your worlds again. And for many couples, by the time they realize how separate they've become, the effort feels insurmountable. 9th moment, when you stop caring about their pain. Here's a hard truth. In a loving relationship, your partner's pain causes you pain. Their suffering matters to you. When they're hurting, you want to help. When they're struggling, you want to support them. Their well-being is tied to your well-being. But when emotional connection dies, so does empathy. Your spouse tells you they're struggling, and you feel nothing. They're in pain, and you can't muster the energy to care. Their problems feel like burdens rather than shared challenges. George, 74 years old, told me he knew his marriage was truly over when his wife was diagnosed with severe arthritis. She was in constant pain, struggling to do basic tasks, emotionally devastated by the loss of her independence. And he felt nothing. No compassion, no desire to help, no emotional response at all. He went through the motions of helping her physically, but emotionally he was completely detached. Her suffering didn't move him. It just annoyed him. This is one of the cruelest aspects of emotional disconnection. The person you once loved, whose happiness was your happiness and whose pain was your pain, becomes someone whose struggles are just inconveniences in your day. When you stop caring about their pain, you've lost one of the most fundamental aspects of love: empathy. And without empathy, you're not partners. You're just two people fulfilling contractual obligations. 10th moment, when divorce feels like relief rather than tragedy. And finally, we come to the ultimate realization. The moment when you think about divorce, separation, or your spouse passing away, and instead of feeling devastated, you feel relieved. Maybe even excited about the possibility of life without them. This is the moment when you know without a doubt that the marriage is over emotionally, even if it continues legally. Because in a real marriage, the thought of losing your partner should be terrifying. It should feel like contemplating the loss of a limb. But when a marriage has died, the thought of losing your partner feels like freedom. I've heard this from so many people. They lie awake at night imagining what life would be like alone. And instead of that thought filling them with dread, it fills them with hope. They calculate their finances to see if they could afford to live separately. They imagine what they'd do with their time. They fantasize about the peace, the freedom, the possibility of happiness. Janet, 69 years old, told me she knew her marriage was over when her husband had a health scare. For a few hours, the doctors thought it might be serious. And instead of feeling terrified, she felt calm, almost hopeful. She was ashamed of that feeling, but she couldn't deny it. The thought of being widowed didn't devastate her. It liberated her. When staying together feels like a prison sentence and leaving feels like parole, your marriage isn't a marriage anymore. It's an institution you're both serving time in. The question we need to ask. So here we are. 10 moments when couples realize they've become strangers. 10 warning signs that the emotional connection has died. And now, we need to ask the hard question. If you recognize these moments in your own marriage, what do you do about it? Because here's the thing. Some marriages can be saved. Some can't. And knowing the difference requires brutal honesty with yourself. If both people want to reconnect, if both people are willing to do the hard work of rebuilding intimacy, communication, and partnership, then recovery is possible. It's not easy. It requires therapy, vulnerability, forgiveness, and sustained effort. But it's possible. But if one or both people have truly checked out, if the desire to reconnect is gone, then sometimes the kindest thing you can do is acknowledge that truth and move forward separately. Because staying in a dead marriage out of fear, obligation, or habit doesn't serve anyone. There's no shame in a marriage ending. Sometimes people grow apart. Sometimes the person you needed at 30 isn't the person you need at 60. Sometimes love dies despite everyone's best efforts. What is shameful is pretending everything is fine when it's not. What's tragic is wasting your remaining years in quiet misery when happiness might be possible, either together with renewed commitment or separately with honest closure. The reality of modern marriage. You know, our parents' generation stayed together no matter what. Divorce was scandalous. You made your bed, you lay in it, end of story. But is that really better? Is it really more virtuous to spend decades with someone who feels like a stranger just to avoid the social stigma of divorce? I don't think so. And I think more and more people our age are realizing that life is too short to spend it in emotional isolation. We've done our duty. We've raised our kids. We've built our careers. We've fulfilled our obligations. And now, in our final decades, we have a choice. Do we continue in marriages that feel more like prisons than partnerships? Or do we have the courage to either fix what's broken or walk away? Now, I'm not advocating for divorce. I'm advocating for honesty. Real, brutal, uncomfortable honesty about the state of your marriage. Because only from a place of honesty can you make real decisions. If your marriage is in trouble, stop pretending it's not. Stop making excuses. Stop telling yourself it's fine when it's not fine. Sit down with your spouse and have the hard conversation. Tell them what you're feeling. Ask them what they're feeling. Be vulnerable. Be honest. Be real. Maybe that conversation leads to a commitment to rebuild. Maybe it leads to couples therapy. Maybe it leads to a trial separation. Maybe it leads to divorce. But wherever it leads, at least you're dealing with reality instead of living in denial. The cost of staying in a dead marriage. Let me tell you what happens when you stay in a marriage that's already dead. You become a ghost. You go through the motions of life without really living. You smile when you're expected to smile, laugh when you're expected to laugh, but inside, you're numb. You're not building memories anymore. You're not experiencing joy. You're just passing time until time runs out. I've seen it so many times. People who stay for the kids, but the kids are 40 years old now. People who stay for financial reasons, but they're financially stable enough to separate. People who stay because they're afraid of being alone, but they're already alone even with someone sleeping next to them every night. And you know what's really sad? These people are so focused on what they might lose by leaving that they don't see what they're already losing by staying. They're losing time. They're losing the possibility of happiness. They're losing the chance to really live before it's too late. Because, let's be real, if you're in your 60s or 70s, you don't have unlimited time left. You've got maybe 20, 30 years if you're lucky and healthy. Do you really want to spend those years in emotional isolation? Do you really want to die having spent the last decades of your life with someone who feels like a stranger? The possibility of renewal. But here's the other side of the coin. Sometimes marriages can be saved. Sometimes that brutal, honest conversation is the wake-up call both people needed. Sometimes recognizing these 10 moments is the first step toward preventing them from becoming permanent. I know a couple, both 63, who were about to divorce. They'd recognized every single one of these 10 moments in their marriage. They'd become complete strangers. But instead of just ending it, they decided to try something radical. They went to intensive couples therapy. Not the once-a-week kind. The kind where you spend a week or a weekend completely focused on your relationship with trained professionals guiding you. And it worked. Not because therapy is magic, but because they both genuinely wanted to reconnect. They were both willing to be vulnerable, to admit their failures, to forgive, to rebuild. It wasn't easy. It took months of continued work. But they rebuilt their emotional intimacy. They learned to communicate again. They rediscovered each other. They're not the same people they were when they got married 40 years ago. And their marriage isn't the same as it was back then. But it's real again. It's alive again. They're partners again instead of strangers. So renewal is possible. But only if both people want it and both people are willing to do the work. You can't save a marriage alone. It takes two people committed to rebuilding what was lost. The courage to choose. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Whether you choose to stay and rebuild or choose to leave and start over, make it a choice. Not a default. Not something that just happens to you. A real, conscious, empowered choice. Too many people in our generation have never made a real choice about their marriage. They got married because that's what you did. They stayed married because that's what you do. They never stopped to ask themselves if this is what they actually want. So ask yourself now, do you want to be in this marriage? Not should you. Not what would people think. Not what's practical or convenient. Do you want this? If the answer is yes, then commit to it fully. Not half-heartedly. Not just staying for lack of a better option. Fully commit to making your marriage the best it can be for whatever time you have left. If the answer is no, then have the courage to act on that truth. Yes, divorce is hard. Yes, it's scary. Yes, people will have opinions. But you know what's harder? Spending the rest of your life in quiet desperation, counting down the days until death releases you from a prison of your own making. You deserve happiness. Your spouse deserves happiness. And if you can't find that together, then finding it apart is better than both of you being miserable together. The legacy we leave. Think about what you're teaching your children and grandchildren about marriage by how you conduct yours. If you stay in a dead marriage out of obligation, what are you teaching them? That marriage is about endurance, not joy? That commitment means suffering and silence? That love is optional, but legal contracts are sacred? Or if you have the courage to either revitalize your marriage or end it with dignity, what are you teaching them? That honesty matters? That happiness is worth pursuing? That it's never too late to make changes that improve your life? Our generation has the opportunity to redefine what marriage looks like in the later years of life. We don't have to follow the old rules that said you stay together no matter how miserable you are. We can create new models. Marriage is a conscious choice renewed regularly, not a one-time decision made at 25 that determines the rest of your life. Marriage as a partnership that evolves or ends gracefully rather than dragging on long after emotional death. We can be the generation that shows our children and grandchildren that love at 60, 70, 80 looks different than love at 20, and that's okay. That sometimes love means staying and fighting for each other. And sometimes love means letting go so both people can find happiness separately. Final thoughts. So here we are at the end of our conversation. We've talked about 10 critical moments when couples realize they've become strangers. We've talked about the painful reality of dead marriages and the difficult choices that come with that recognition. If you've recognized your marriage in these 10 moments, I know this has been hard to hear. I know it's uncomfortable to acknowledge these truths. But awareness is always the first step toward change. You can't fix what you won't admit is broken. Talk to your spouse. Be honest. Be vulnerable. Be real. Figure out together whether your marriage can be saved and whether both of you want to save it. And then make a conscious choice based on that truth. Remember, you're not a bad person if your marriage is failing. You're not a failure if you get divorced at 65. You're a human being trying to navigate the complicated reality of long-term relationships. Give yourself grace. Give your spouse grace. And give yourself permission to want more than just coexistence. Life is short. Make sure you're really living it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, it's never too late to choose happiness. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.